Oh, I wish you wouldn't ask these hard questions. Autonomy, I suppose, is actually a synonym in this case for independent. You see, what you need in routing, as in any large system, is some form of abstraction. You need to be able to clump together things that are the same and treat them as one. That way you can scale. Because if you just regarded the internet as a collection of a few trillion atoms, everyone's brain would melt and the system wouldn't work. So we group together groups of connected hosts and their associated IP addresses and call them an autonomous network. Now, what do we mean by autonomous? Or, as I prefer to say it, independent. Well, every network has the ability to determine how it connects to the other networks that make up the internet. And that decision as to how it connects is its own decision. It's not determined by anyone else. It has its own free will in some ways, its own autonomy. So I might run a network here and say, well, I choose to connect to service provider Fred. And you might be running a network in your town. And you might say, well, Fred's a bit expensive up here. I'm going to connect to service provider Carol. And that independent decision is yours to make.
You're listening to Ping, a podcast by APNIC discussing all things related to measuring the internet. I'm your host, George Michelson. This time, I'm talking to Geoff Huston from APNIC Labs again, in his regular monthly spot on Ping. This is Geoff's first Ping episode for 2026, and he's kicking off the year with his annual review of what's been happening in BGP. It's a look back over 2025 in routing. Geoff has been doing this analysis for over a decade, and normally it's a series of up and to the right charts across almost any measure you care to mention. Although we should note that there's always been a level of noise in the BGP system, the more specifics from traffic engineering and deaggregation, and to some extent that's constant undergrowth. Geoff has detected some changes in the dynamics of the BGP trend lines this time round. We may be entering a new phase of routing, something we haven't seen before. It's going to be interesting to see how things emerge across 2026 and into the future. Geoff, welcome to 2026 and welcome back to Ping. What should we talk about this time?
Well, thank you, George. And yes, welcome to 2026. Look, it's the start of another year, and I've often used to, at the start of each year, sort of look back over the previous year and sort of see how the internet fared.
I've been looking in the archives and I can see you doing this for the last 10 years. You've probably been doing it since before then, but that's 10 years of a look at BGP in the APNIC blog.
Well, that's it. And the reason why I do it is actually really, I suppose, quite odd in some ways. You see, when you try and look at something as large as the internet, you typically only see what's close to you, your neck of the woods. It's like looking out at the weather. I know precisely the weather where I live within a radius of a few kilometres. I can tell you what it's like, but where you are, George, and you don't live close to me, it's kind of, I don't have a clue. And how would I directly find out? Well, I'd have to go there. And it's kind of the same with the internet in so many ways. I can look at the internet from where I sit, but that's not the same as the internet from where you sit, and so on. But there's one thing, and it's kind of magic, that brings all the internet to you, all of it. And oddly enough, that's the routing protocol. Because when I announce a route into the routing system, hi everyone, you can reach 10.0.0.1 from here. The job of the routing system is to actually carry that little announcement everywhere. So wherever you might be, if you look at the routing system, you'll see me. You'll see my routes. And it kind of works the other way too, that if I turn on a BGP router and look at it, I get to see everybody's route all at once.
Now you get to see them, but if I were sitting in Paris, wish I was, I'm not, and I turned on BGP and I looked at routes, I'd expect to see the same thing you see, but surely there's some difference between how I see it, some quality in it, that we see slightly different versions of the same thing, like we're looking at the same elephant, but from different sides?
Well, to some extent. You see, In terms of saying, I advertise an address prefix, that address prefix is pretty constant no matter where we are. So the job of BGP is to carry that routing advertisement across the entire internet fabric and do it quickly. But the other job about BGP, which is kind of obvious if you think about it, is to avoid the formation of loops. You see, if Alice tells Bob, tells Carol, tells Jim, tells Alice, then that stuff is going to start looping. And effectively, BGP needs to know, because BGP is just a rumor protocol. Whenever you find something, you just tell your neighbors. You need to have a really neat way of figuring out, hey, hang on a second, I've been told that. I don't need to get told it again.
Right.
And you need loop detection. Now, the way this works in BGP is the internet is not just one vast, humongous thing. It's actually a connection of, we call them autonomous systems, discrete subnetworks, and they're typically geographically limited.
That word autonomous it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because it doesn't really crop up very often in normal conversation, and it has different meanings depending on what you're talking about. Like an autonomous robot would be really very specifically about the robot moving freely and not under the control of any external system. Well, BGP systems don't move like that. They're not machines in that sense. The autonomy word here it's interesting. What is it trying to say?
Oh, I wish you wouldn't ask these hard questions. Autonomy, I suppose, is actually a synonym in this case for independent. You see, what you need in routing, as in any large system, is some form of abstraction. You need to be able to clump together things that are the same and treat them as one. That way you can scale. Because if you just regarded the internet as a collection of a few trillion atoms, everyone's brain would melt and the system wouldn't work. So we group together groups of connected hosts and their associated IP addresses and call them an autonomous network. Now, what do we mean by autonomous? Or, as I prefer to say it, independent? Well, every network has the ability to determine how it connects to the other networks that make up the internet. And that decision as to how it connects is its own decision. It's not determined by anyone else. It has its own free will in some ways, its own autonomy. So I might run a network here and say, well, I choose to connect to service provider Fred. And you might be running a network in your town and you might say, well, Fred's a bit expensive up here. I'm going to connect to service provider Carol. And that independent decision is yours to make, as is mine.
Right. And I could also choose to say to Carol, this bit of my network I want you to carry, but I could have some other relationship with a geezer called Bob, and I could choose to tell him different things. Again, it's my decision what I choose to tell the people that I get to carry my bits.
Really, really bad idea. Glad you fell into that rabbit trap. Don't do it.
Don't do it.
Don't do it. You see, the assumption in the routing system in BGP is that all the networks in an autonomous system are treated the same way.
Oh, wow.
You can't hive some of them off and treat them differently. And the reason why is this whole thing around how do we do loop detection? So let's just work through that I'm a bunch of networks where I'm sitting, and I'm going to be, I think I called myself Carol, didn't I? Why?
It's a good name.
Yeah, it's just, in actual fact, technologically, it's just a number, 131072, whatever. It's just a unique label that no one else has. It's mine. And when I announce a route to my neighbors, because that's what BGP does, you just talk to your neighbors, you say, hi, I'm Network Carol, and here are a bunch of networks that you can reach in me.
Prefixes. Here are a bunch of prefixes.
A bunch of address prefixes. 10.1/24, 10.2/24, blah, blah, blah. And my neighbors will go, okay, well, I will take those prefixes and I will add the label Carol. They tell their neighbors. But let's take one particular neighbor, Bob. So Bob learns this route to an address prefix 10.0201, label Carol. And when he tells his neighbors,
yep,
Bob says, Well, you can reach them through me, but I don't actually have these addresses. Carol does. So the new label is Bob, then Carol.
It's an ordered list. You stick your name on the front, and whatever you heard, you tell people with your autonomy tagged on the front.
Right. So as each network learns a prefix, it sticks its identifier, what we call an AS number, but, it's just a label, onto the front of this list and sends it onward. So as networks move through the interconnection fabric, as prefixes move through that interconnection fabric, that list of networks you need to go through to get to it gets larger and larger. Think of it as a snail trail, a history path.
Yeah.
This is the way the reachability information propagated, so that if you follow the path backwards, you will get to that prefix.
And the loop part, I'm guessing, is that sooner or later, you, Carol, you're going to hear somebody giving you this rumor. Psst, I heard that Bob can reach this network, and the network Bob can reach is Carol's network. And at that point, you go, aha, that's me.
I'm Carol. I know that. Even if someone said to Bob, psst, Bob looks at the path and says, but I'm already on that list. I told someone else who told someone else who told someone else who's telling me. I may not have originated it, but it's a loop, right? And so you can't get told stuff you already know by attribute of the AS path. So let's now go back to your fractured example.
I don't want to tell everyone the same thing.
I'm going to tell Bob half my prefixes and I'm going to tell Jim the other half. And that's okay. But the issue is, in essence, the prefix path. And let's say someone then tries to tell Bob about stuff I told Jim, then you have the potential of causing a loop. But what if someone tells me? Loop formation becomes a whole lot, more difficult when you start splitting your routes up. Not the best of ideas.
Yeah.
Not the best. Typically, you want a single routing policy with a single autonomous network. That's kind of what makes it work best.
So the difference between I see everything in this world, because the entry point for this conversation is everybody gets to see the same information. The difference is, how does that loop detection snail trail look to me compared to how it looks to you? The actual thing, the announcement of the prefix, that part should look the same everywhere. But the trail of ASs that identify how I learned it, that might look a bit different. Is that it?
Well, that's exactly right. So we might look at the same map of a city, and it's the same map. But where I sit, if I was then to draw on this map, how do I get to destination A, destination B? All the lines I would draw on that map are relative to me. You will draw different lines relative to your position on that map. And that's what's going on with BGP. It's basically, it's meant to carry the same information everywhere, but as it carries it, it carries the path of how that information was propagated, and that path information varies with each BGP speaker, with each listener, because the path they obtain that information from naturally differs. And so the issue is, what's useful to understand in these aggregated views? Well, a number of things. How big's the internet? Really big. Okay. Is it growing? Well, I guess so.
You'd think so. People are selling more and more devices that connect to it, so there's more people on it than there used to be.
Well, I don't know. The number of devices I have in my house hasn't changed for a few years. I'm replacing, not adding. So it's kind of an interesting question, isn't it? Because when you think about it, there is a difference between throwing one out and adding another and adding a new one, or throwing more out than I actually had, shrinking. And so networks do, grow, shrink, or stay the same. And it's kind of useful information to know why. Aha. Now, the next thing to understand is, why do we do routing? Well, we just do. No, because the issue with the internet is that it is a stateless hop-by-hop forwarding system. Well, that's easy to say. What does it mean?
Stateless.
Stateless is the big key word. And I'm going to contrast this a tiny bit with the old telephone system, which, 20 years ago was an easy thing to do because everyone understood how it worked. Today, it's kind of telephone system. I'm sorry, what was that? Well, bring out your history books, children, and let's go through this nonsense. You see, the old telephone system was stateful. What do you mean by stateful? Well, when I tried to make a call, pick up the handset, remember them, dial a number, remember that, then the network itself would establish a state within the relevant switches to go, I'm going to make a set of connected forwarding decisions. Geoff's phone is connected to exchange A, and the call that he's making is connected from exchange A to circuit, along this circuit to the next exchange, to reach George. And that state is almost as if it's hardwired. You can imagine little ladies on big telephone patch systems plugging in the cords for the call. And for the duration of the call, that's now hardwired into the phone system. When I hang up, the plugs are removed.
So that system kind of has an organic quality that when that system was literally your voice making the volts vary on a piece of copper between you and the exchange, they were literally sitting on a chair connecting a copper plug to connect it to the next link up the chain. It was a static circuit. If you put a light bulb across that, presumably you could make the light bulb turn on because there was a wire circuit all the way.
In the early days when we were switching connectivity, yes.
And when we cut it over so that there were radio links and this links and that links and shifted up in frequency, we kept the model the same, that when you said, I want to make the connection, it was as if there was that full circuit loop, even if bits of it were kind of different.
We started sharing the conductor, the wire. We're sharing it. And there are a number of ways that you could share it. Frequency division, multiplexing, that one carrier signal is a higher frequency than another and they don't interfere. But the cleverest way of sharing is to actually share bits of time. So I divide the network up into, say, 10 slots, and the clocks are all synchronized. So at time 1, it's slot 1, time 2, slot 3, slot 4. And in essence, I've got slot 1 for my conversation. And all the packets in slot 1 get routed in a certain way. Now, this is interesting because the packets don't need to know where they're going. They don't. The network knows where the packets are going. The network routes the call and forwards the call. And in essence, if the network state is there, the call is working. When the network drops that state, nothing happens anymore. The network has lost the knowledge of how to get connection from one end to the other.
So even with having this sharing, the basic model of how do things know where to go is there's state in the system, it's stateful, it's structured, it's predictable, and it's based on aspects like the structure in that number. That telephone number you were dialing told the system which bits of state to use and construct in order to make that call happen. That was the old model. But you've said the new model ain't like that.
Well, the old model was based on expensive networks and cheap, dumb peripherals, which, when we talk about humans, cheap and dumb might well be true. And the artifact of the network was the pinnacle of shared technology. So it made sense economically as much as technically. But as we progressed with the world of computing, what we found was that over the evolution of time, computers got bigger, faster, cheaper. They didn't need to, if you will, outsource that problem to a central network. They could do something quite different. They could actually label each quantum of information, each item with, I'm going to George and I'm from Geoff. So as well as just sending a little bit of the call, they sent a header that said where it's coming from and where it was going to. What did this mean? Well, if every packet is labeled with where it's going to, you actually don't need network state. As long as each switch in the middle knows all possible destinations, then when a packet comes into George, it looks up its little table and says, I know where George is, interface number 3, out you go packet. And oddly enough, that makes really cheap networks because you put a lot of the problem back again to the endpoints of having to label every single packet with, who it's from and who it's intended to. The only trick is now in every switch, instead of having state per call, which is expensive, you have to load up all possible destinations and their relative switching position.
And I'm going to go with BGP is how you trade that information about what exists out there that everyone has to know. The path bit is kind of how you know that it's not in a loop. And what you have to do is work out what you want to record in your system about what you're going to do with this address. How are you going to deal with it? That's your local decision. But BGP is how you're told you have a decision to make.
Right. So BGP is kind of the provisioning protocol. Why is this so good? Well, let's say that there were 20 ways to get between me and you. Well, the routing system will actually make a call. It will select what it thinks is the best route. But what if that breaks? Bushfires, floods, some idiot pulling a plug out of a socket, anything's possible. Routing systems are able to self-heal on the fly so that, in essence, even in the middle of a conversation, the routing system can reconfigure the network in response to some incident, and the packets will continue to flow. So the networks become a whole lot more resilient and a whole lot more able to be cope with the various forms of things that would otherwise completely disrupt, a stateful network, because there is no state. And in essence, all you're doing in the routing protocol is to make sure that the network is constantly talking to itself, those switches, about who can reach what. So the implication of all of this is that in every major switch, it needs to carry a complete set of reachable address prefixes. Many years ago, the internet had about 20,000 such prefixes. 20,000 32-bit prefixes is 20,000 32-bit words of memory. And in today's world, you kind of go, oh, yeah, boring. Back in the world of the late 80s, that wasn't exactly boring. It was, a reasonable load.
So this question, how big is the network? I mean, there's the academic exercise. We're sitting down the pub and we're interested in having a Guinness Book of Records conversation. Is it bigger or smaller? You've actually gone to, turns out when you're building one of these things, decisions like how big it is affects how you build it. How much memory do you have to put into every active element to hold the things that are going to represent this network? And back then, that size limit was something we might look at and say, that's peanuts. But at the time, that was actually a non-trivial decision. That stuff cost money.
Well, it costs money, but let's introduce another problem, that I have to do that lookup inside the time it takes to send a packet. So if I've got a network with a line that's got, 1 million bits per second, then I actually don't need to shovel that many packets. 1,000 packets a second, I need to do a lookup in 1,000th of a second. For computers, that's kind of easy, right? But who runs a megabit wire these days? Nobody. All of a sudden these days, the lines are a whole lot faster. And inside a switching system, I might just not have one line. I might have 100, 200, all of which are running at, 200 gigabits per second, 200,000 megabits per second. So how many packets per second do I have to cope with in this switch? And the answer is, buddy, a lot. So much that we can't quite make memory fast enough.
So the thing here is, if you can't look up the forwarding decision you need to make as you're reading the packet in and seeing the bits of the address you're sending it to, you've got to put it somewhere. So you've got to both delay the packet and you've got to have somewhere to put it. And you've still got to have the space in your memory to have the giant table of all the different things you can look up. And that's time and space are not working in your favor. What you want is to get rid of that packet as quickly as humanly possible.
So even if you give yourself one packet's time, you don't do it bit by bit, but you assemble a packet, you look up the net with your forwarding tables, you make a forwarding decision and get rid of the packet. You need to do so without taking longer than the time for the next packet to get assembled and be ready to be switched. Because if you start taking more time than that, you can't get rid of the packets as quickly as they're arriving. Bad things happen. So oddly enough, that memory is one of the most expensive items in a router. It's more expensive than the processing system because you need brilliantly fast memory.
Special memory.
The best we can build, DDR4 or whatever. It's not particularly special. It's just particularly fast, really fast.
Right.
And the real question is then, how much do I need? And what it means is I've got to store all those reachable address prefixes in my router. But I'm not just buying a router for today. Hi, the network routing system has increased in size by 10,000 address prefixes. Can I get a new router, please? Hi, another 10,000. Can I get a new router? It doesn't work like that, does it?
No.
That's instant death.
So what we're getting to here is how big is the network is not just a pub conversation. It affects how you build it. And a second order function, how quickly is it growing, if it is growing, is important because you need to know how big it is and how big it's growing to plan forward for when you're next going to buy a unit of expensive equipment.
Right.
And this is some of the most expensive purchasing you're going to make.
Yep. And, we've scared ourselves completely in years gone by. The first of these shocks was actually in around 1990, just as the internet was taking off. And it was pointed out that the growth of the routing system was going to run out of available addresses within a couple of years. Oops. But equally was going to run out of viable routing in about the same period. We needed to do something pretty quickly because at that point, the internet would have outgrown available hardware. We just couldn't route it anymore. Now, the whole thing about addressing is the V6 story and so on. The thing about routing was a bit curious. And the way we solved it, oddly enough, was to get rid of the implicit structure in addressing and got to a point what we call classless routing, that instead of having big networks, medium networks, and teeny tiny networks,
the Goldilocks problem.
We eventually said, look, any size you like in terms of the number of bits, you decide how many or how big each network is, how big each prefix is. If you're a big network, one prefix will cover millions of individual hosts. If you're a teeny tiny network, one prefix will cover a couple of hundred hosts.
So this actually is quite an interesting point, isn't it? Because people think big size is about how many host objects you can address. Oh, I've got a bigger network than you. I've got a /16 with 65,000. I've only got a /24 with 256. But if each of those are announced as one thing in routing, the big one has a cost of one route and the little one has a cost of one route. Their cost is the same, which means the efficiency of making an announcement is different. The /16 is a more efficient announcement.
Oh, yes, bigger networks. Yes, it's the same cost in your router. And if the routing economics folk had their way, the world would be a couple of hundred massive routes. But it's always a compromise between the elasticity of routing, what you want to achieve, the functionality, and its cost.
So you've been looking at this for quite a long time, at least 10 years in the APNIC blog and on Potteroo, but probably before. And you've also said there's been a remarkable consistency across that time, that it's been an up and to the right cost in terms of how much memory, how much speed, how much computing power is needed to make this machine fly. And consistently, we've been able to meet that market demand. Even though we've had some moments like in the late 90s where we panicked, there hasn't been a catastrophic failure to achieve the necessary growth. Are things carrying on the same way? Are we in the same story?
Well, it was sort of a refined question because at the same time, dear old Moore's Law and the refinement of chips was actually making sure that we could cope with some growth and keep our costs constant. So as long as the network wasn't doubling in size every, say, 6 months, that would be a nightmare. If it's doubling in size every, say, 4 years, yawn, nothing to see here. Why? Because as long as Moore's Law keeps on doubling the capacity of silicon about every 18 months to 2 years, then it's not a big deal that the network is growing as long as the costs are not going up as well. if I can keep on acquiring equipment that will constrain that problem to a fixed cost point, I can accommodate growth in the routing system. So we've had our issues. The first one was the internet boom of the year 2000. What happened then? Well, everybody, it was the AI of the turn of the millennium. It was the Bitcoin. It was everyone wanted a web page. Everyone was piling in. And the routing system basically doubled inside of 6 months. And a lot of us got worried. We were discussing, did we need new routing systems? Did we need to actually change the way routing worked? And there were a few proposals around that period, around 98, around the whole thing of tunneling and forwarding in different ways.
Yeah.
What fixed the problem? The bubble burst. And a whole bunch of people stopped routing and some sanity prevailed. And it's kind of, well, back to our beds. Everything's fine. And the internet kept on growing, but growing at a rate that was under Moore's law.
So there was an odd moment for me there. This is around the time that I finally had people say, we'd rather you didn't have privileges to control routers. And the reason was we'd put a protection limit in our router config to say, you haven't got memory. Don't run if you see more than a certain number of things. And we'd forgotten we'd put that ceiling in, and that growth trend you're talking about, well, it had kind of flattened out and we'd got away with this, but things were ticking along at a slow rate. We kicked over that limit. And the way the limit worked was it said, you hit this limit, drop everything on the floor and start again. And we were basically getting about 72 hours of stable routing before it would creep up to receiving that last little message coming in. And then it would go, too much, and drop everything. And we were sitting there going, why is it every 3 days our routing fails? When they found that it was a fixed limit that we hadn't documented and put in the config, they looked at me and they said, yeah, you shouldn't be doing this configuration anymore, buddy. And they took my permits away.
Wouldn't have been the first to have got caught like that. And you certainly weren't the last. One of the major Australian providers got caught the same way a couple of years ago. Insidious problems when the routing system gets bigger than, your available memory, and basically it will shut down. So we track this stuff closely. And certainly one of the reasons is you look at that first order differential of growth. And the real issue is
rate of growth.
The rate of growth.
Rather than just the simple growth, what is the rate of change in this growth?
Is it growing faster than our ability to make new silicon, to cope with it? So in other words, how does the rate of growth compare to our expectations of next year's chips, of the year afters? And of course, the vendors who are trying to sell equipment to go, she'll be great, mate. She'll work for 5 years, no sweat. Well, they're trying to build a system that is actually configured not for today's network, but for a network with 5 years of inbuilt growth. So the real question is, well, what model of projection did you use for that 5 years of growth? I don't know, mate. Well, you got to do something. And a lot of us started to look at this with a lot of seriousness going, what is the shape of that growth and how does it affect what we're doing?
So we've moved a conversation of how big is the internet from being just a matter of winning to being, no, it actually affects how we build it, to being, I don't care how big it is, I want to know how fast it's growing.
Right.
Because I've got to build the box it fits in. And if it's going to get too big for the box, it can be a big box or a little box, but if it doesn't fit, I'm in trouble.
So if the rate of growth is linear, it's actually oddly enough really easy. Because in essence, I need to make the box this much bigger each year, and I can project that forward in 5 years, and it's 5 times this much bigger. And in some ways, linear is not going to cause anyone to lose sleep. The nightmare is exponential growth. Because if this thing doubles in size every year, then all of a sudden I need double the capacity in my routers every 12 months. After 5 years, 2 to the 5th, dude, 2 to the 5th, that's 16 times the size. Now, if that 16 times the size unit is more than 16 times the cost, then this is looking particularly unattractive.
Yeah.
So exponential growth is really, really hard to cope with. And it only kind of works as long as the growth is under the ability of the technology to map it. And so the whole question in looking at the size of the routing table is, how are we doing with Moore's law and chip technology? how much faster and capable are we getting as a trend line, and how fast is the network growing, and do the trend lines work? Because if it's growing faster than our technology, we've got some serious problems and we need to rethink the way we do stateless forwarding. If it's under that trend line, the answer is press on, dude. Everything is just fine. We can cope.
Now, the marvelous thing about radio is that radio is not brilliant at showing people pictures. So at this point, I'm going to say, if you actually find yourself interested in what is really happening, no matter what gets said in the rest of this podcast, you are going to actually have to go and look at the charts, because it's pretty hard to communicate them over the medium of sound. And Geoff has been publishing this information every year pretty consistently, and each one reflects back on prior history. So you don't need to go looking at all of them, although you can do, because it's interesting. You've pretty much carried that time history, that time series of growth and change and rate of change into each version of this story as you publish it each year, haven't you?
Yes. So we started with the move from the rarefied atmosphere of research and, academic endeavor into the consumer market, dial-up modems, DSL. We then had the next big shift when the internet moved into mobile phones, the release of the Apple iPhone and its ilk. And that was a massive impetus. All of a sudden, we could number the users in billions, and the size of the routing system was 200,000, 400,000, etc. It grew as the networks expanded to accommodate. Everyone wanted a mobile phone. Everyone wanted two. Damn them, I don't know why. But there are a lot of people and a lot of mobile phones.
And we also had the rise of middle-class consumerism in economies that previously just hadn't had exposure to this technology. So not only were we seeing new classes of use in the developed West in the G20, we were seeing the tiger economies in Asia with huge populations suddenly getting mass subscription to internet, huge numbers of new entrants, new addresses, new prefixes, new providers coming into the system.
So, in the 5 years from 2015 to 2020, the size of the network in terms of the number of things that are in the routing system, the number I have to cram into these boxes, lifted from 500,000 to 900,000.
Ooh.
In other words, a router that was 5 years old was either extravagantly over-provisioned when I bought it and it was able to still cope, or it wasn't and it's now dead because it couldn't cope.
500,000 to 900,000
in 5 years.
5 years. So that's pretty accelerated growth.
Right. Now, in theory, Moore's Law was sucking that up, going, no problem, dude, but it's still a big number. Now, what happened around the time that COVID happened, 2020, 2021, is that a lot of things stopped just in their tracks. And one of the things that stopped in its tracks was actually the expansion of this network. Just stopped. Now, it didn't go flat, but the growth rates were remarkably small. So in that period, 2021, 2022, in fact, the 5 years from 2020 to 2025, it grew by under 200,000. So 500,000 in the previous.
It's a useful reminder that we can talk about what we think is happening because of technology and our beliefs in behavior of individuals. Oh, I'm going to get the shiny new M4 Mac. When you grow up to the scale of measuring what economies do, it's not the same as what you or I do. There was an economic component to this. It was just not happening because everyone's economy kind of went to sleep for a while because goods and services were just not happening at scale.
Not happening. So it kind of went to sleep. And the recovery into growth hasn't happened as rapidly in the last year or two. Why not? Well,
wow, we've had a shock event like the GFC in prior times, but instead of a post-slump boom and a recovery to the old rate, you're saying you're actually seeing a change in the trend line as the economy comes back into play.
It came back more slowly and has been going more slowly. It's been growing, but the growth rates are 30,000, 40,000 new networks a year, dramatically lower. It's as if this market is now saturated and that I can fit no more mobile phones into my pockets. My car has so many SIMs that it doesn't need another SIM card. Connectivity is not, if you will, in great demand to increase.
So we've seen this over time and time again. The world lives with pianolas, and some guy called Marconi invents this thing called radio, and there is a massive surge in uptake of homes having radios and a drop-off in homes having pianolas. But then every home has a radio, and sales in radios kind of tips off. And around the 1950s, some smart dudes invent TV, and there is a massive surge in people buying and selling TVs until things tip off. And then they invent color TV, and the story repeats. That technology adoption curve, it's always had a quality. Starts kind of slow, amazing midlife crisis period when things are going gangbusters, tails off a bit as the market saturates. You're seeing that kind of a shape of behavior in the system?
We are. We've all got our devices, and these days I don't replace them. In fact, I might replace them, but I don't buy more. I'm not adding to the load as an individual consumer, and most of us aren't. And so the network is kind of tapering off in its growth trajectory. Now, throughout all this conversation, and there is still growth, but I'd say it's sort of linear, we've had a conversation exclusively about IPv4. And it's reasonable to say right now that a linear projection of around 34,000 entries a year is a decent projection for the next 5 years to v4. But wind it back to 1990, we thought we had a problem, and we convinced everyone, including ourselves, that we did. We needed to have a new protocol. It needed to have more addresses. It's called V6. And V6 has been slowly getting deployed for, the last 30 years.
That's a long time. And slow here means we have not stopped needing V4. We've just needed both V4 and V6.
For a long time. And by long, I mean up to around 2015, 2018, the size of the V6 network was under 50,000 routing entries. Compared to V4, it was tiny, insignificant, and in terms of its value, I think it was relatively low. It was still the domain of the enthusiast. It wasn't a threat.
I do want to say, as a slight contrarian on this, those prefixes were phenomenally efficient statements, because to the extent you had 6, you didn't need to announce lots of itty-bitty little pieces because you'd been given lots of itty-bitty little pieces of address. You had one giant block, and you were able to announce efficiently all of your 6 with one prefix announcement. So I agree the rate of growth was slow, and I agree it was a bunch of enthusiasts and not economically relevant, but it was very efficient.
Human nature makes fools of us all, George, and including that last statement.
Uh-oh.
What we call fragmentation. And it's a typical technique in routing because you're trying to achieve a number of things, including the quality of the service, defense against attacks, all kinds of things, that you tend to announce a big covering aggregate, we call it. Here's all my addresses in one prefix. And then you also say, here's a prefix, here's a little one, here's a little one. You take out the elements and separately announce it. It's as if you say, here's a car, and here's wheel number 1, wheel number 2, wheel number 3, shock absorbers, screen.
Oh, you do the thing that 30 minutes ago you said, don't do that. It's a bad idea.
Right, you announce all the components. And if I look at the V4 routing table, which is currently a little over 1.1 million, 1/2 of those announcements are actually covered by others already.
Wow.
In other words, 50%, to be perfectly frank, 52.4%
wow.
of all announcements in V4 are more specific. They don't tell you how to reach new addresses. They just qualify previous reachability.
So hit me with the clue stick about V6 and how much that happens.
You were saying, well, V6 makes this so much better, doesn't it? V6 has kind of got all this sussed, but one big announcement, I can actually announce a whole bunch of things. I don't need to do more specifics.
There I was believing it. So how many are there in V6?
Well, 58.7% are more specific.
It's less efficient.
It's less efficient. And in actual fact, even though these addresses are remarkably big, a lot of people announce what we call a /32, which is the kind of bundle they typically get from their regional internet registry. And then they get out the chopping board and go /48, /48, /48.
Wow.
Tiny little bits. And 2/3 of the routing system are actually /48s in V6.
So you slipped through there. History, we were sitting at around 900,000. As of today, V4 is now broken through the million mark.
Yeah.
And roughly half of them are more specifics because people are engineering a smarter outcome. You slipped in that V6, for its birth up to about 2018, there wasn't a hell of a lot of it. What have the numbers done since then in absolute size, Geoff? What's 6 at if V4 is at over 1 million?
Well, V6 is now kicking 200,000 entries.
Whoa.
Yeah, well, that's okay. It's less than a quarter of the size of V4. Well, from memory terms, think again, dude, because, like it or not, each entry is 128 bits long, 4 times the size. So if I was mapping out my memory use to be a router, then 200,000 entries in V6 takes up much the same real estate as just under 1 million entries in V4.
So we've doubled the memory burden. If you needed 1 million memory costs to do 4, because of dual stack and V6 inefficiency, you need 2 million. Oh, wow.
Yeah, no, we need 2 million.
Wow.
And because there's enough V4 that no one's brave enough to do 6 only, everyone's running both. You can't just run a V6 only network. Maybe sometime in the future that might be the case, but not today. So in actual fact, everyone who wants to sort of play this game, if you're playing the V6 game, you can't stop playing the V4 game. You can elect not to do V6, but you can't elect not to do V4.
So a number of years ago, I wrote a rather silly piece with Emil Arben from Ripe. We called it Routing Pixies. We imagined every night a routing pixie went around, counted up how many V4 you needed, counted up how many V4 AT&T needed, and instead of all these random prefixes that you were announcing, we just swap the addresses so you get a single block that's as big as you need to announce. And you can, in principle, handle the traffic in the global network with the same number of players announcing routes for the volume of 4 with a lot less than 1 million routes if you had a routing pixie to swap your addresses. And I have wondered if we shouldn't open up a new kind of trading market, not to get new addresses, but to swap them with the people who've got the other half of what you hold so that you can have 1 prefix instead of 2. Are we ever going to see any efficiencies come into this, Geoff?
Well, it's weirder than that, George. It's always weirder. I'm a big router. I have, let's say, 10 exterior connections, which for a big core router is actually a lot. Most folk have 1 or 2. So I have this routing table that has 1 million V4 entries and 200,000 V6 entries. And each of them have a forwarding decision that says interface 1, interface 2, interface 3, or interface 4. That's your lot. So I've got this massive table, but there's only 4 answers. And you sit there and go, why don't I compress it? That if I find an adjacent bunch of addresses, why don't I smack them together and keep on smacking them together? And in actual fact, you can do what we call fib compression.
You don't care about origin AS. You just care about which port on your box it's coming and going on.
Right. How small can I make the decision process? Because small is fast. And there are a number of router vendors that do feature fib compression. And you can get that number right down if you're prepared to go down that path. You're swapping space for processing.
Yeah.
And if space is your major problem and you've got enough processing grunt, well, that's easy. Processing grunt just fixes it. So, yes, people have gone there and have tried to solve it. And there are solutions around. So it's not quite as dire as we make out. There's always solutions. But I want to go somewhere slightly different. You see, for the last 4 years, V6 has been growing like crazy growing. The growth models for V6, say 2 or 3 years ago, were clearly exponential, super linear. Every year, it wasn't just 10,000, 20,000, it was growing each year over and on the growth, But then COVID happened. And what COVID did was it stopped the V6 rollout beyond where it had currently reached. And so what we found is that in the developed world, which in terms of V6 is a relatively small world, it's the US, bits of Canada, Western Europe, not Southern Europe, bits of Asia, but not all, and nowhere else. Not in Africa.
That's the V6 world. It's kind of fitted that hole.
Spotty.
And it's not occupying new territory.
It's not. The only country, the last big country to move was India in 2017. China is moving, but it's such a big problem. Its movement is incredibly slow. And none of the other big populations.
So India was a hell of a move. India was not an insignificant move, was it?
Oh, it was breathtaking. But there's a massive population of users in Nigeria, and every last one of them is on V4, and there's no signs of movement. And so what it kind of points out, I suppose, is that almost a bit like saturation and stagnation, the V6 world has kind of got to this point of a metastable equilibrium where those that have it, those that don't feel they're missing out on anything, and nothing much is changing. And that's reflected in the routing system. Because now when I put the projection models against the last 4 years, I don't see exponential growth. I don't see linear growth. I actually see a logistical saturation curve that has peaked. And the stats say that the V6 table will shrink over the next 3 years if it continues the current trajectory. Now, that's nonsense. That's just maths lying to us, You can't take that seriously.
But it does say that it is not super growth. It's not in any sense on a...
Oh, God, it's hardly growth at all. All of those growth factors have disappeared from the market, and just a few economies are doing more 6. Those that haven't are not doing more 6. Those that haven't got it, by and large, aren't, apart from just a small number of players. And so what we actually find in the large scheme of things in today's world is V4, you've got about 34,000 entries a year that you've got to cope with that are new, and that looks pretty stable. Interesting.
And that's set against an existing state of around 1 million things to deal with. So we're talking a lowish increment in the 1 to 2% mark on your existing state is your burden of growth.
Right. With V6, I currently need about 250,000 routes. In 2 years' time, 2 whole years, it will peak at 260,000. In 4 years, it'll still be at 260,000. And the maths say in 2032, it will actually be lower at 251. It will have peaked and gone down. Now, that's maths. That's just fitting a polynomial curve against recent data.
But it bears thinking about, doesn't it? Because if we go back to the base economics, what would a telco do in a situation like this? When the logistics of being a telco demands you capitalize your routing every single year to expect doubling in 5, you have to think a certain way. If somebody comes at you and says, no, you're probably going to be able to sweat the current technology for longer if you can afford to just do small increments in it with minor upgrades, that's very tempting to say, right, freeze on capital spend.
Well, of course it is. Of course it is. The telco makes money by sort of buying something and sweating the asset for as long as it possibly can, because in essence, I've got to buy up front and then I sell its functionality to users. The longer it can be sort of placed into an active life, the greater my revenue, the greater my return, the more I want to defray getting a new one. The only reason why we used to refresh equipment every few years was to sort of keep the competitors at bay. Moore's Law kept on saying that, the competitors were buying new equipment, it was costing them less, I needed to recapitalize. But again, the other part of the stasis argument is Moore's Law has stopped giving. And if it stopped giving, next year's equipment's the same cost and the same functionality as this year's, I don't need to buy. And what that means is that a lot of these growth trajectories in V6 are slackening off. We've eased off the accelerator. Those that have it, fine, no need to go back. Those that don't feel the need to change. And when I say those that don't, I am talking about the entire continent of Africa, large amounts of Southern Europe, all of Eastern Europe and Western Asia, and bits of South America.
It's going to be different pressures that drive change in their technology basis. It's not going to be the underlying economics or the technology needs to make a network work.
Yeah, it's not the fear of missing out, the fear of new markets, the need to move. What we're actually seeing right now in the routing system is an entirely different dynamic, that the infrastructure of the internet has reached this sort of equilibrium point that says, until we get another technology shock, nothing's changing. Nothing. It's kind of sitting there going, I'm okay, and I look to be okay tomorrow. That's as good as I get, but that's okay. And the world's attention, all the venture capital, we're not building more internet.
Wow.
We're building more AI data centers. All the trillions of dollars, and it is trillions of dollars, is actually turned into the next global fascination. And the internet, solved problem, dude. We're cool.
Yeah.
We don't need to worry.
We've gone back to maybe where we always should have been. We're plumbing. And plumbing isn't exciting right now compared to other stories out there.
George, I always thought we were sewerage technicians.
Yeah.
Even more unglamorous.
Geoff, that's fascinating. I think people definitely should be diving in to look at your charts and the numbers and get a sense of the dynamics of this story for themselves. This is a moment of change. We're not seeing what we used to see. We've got to think differently into the future. I think that's really interesting.
Well, it certainly kept me entertained, and hopefully, dear listeners, if you're still with us, you're being entertained too. I'm here. I'm happy to answer questions you might have, or look up the numerous articles on the history of routing that I've written over the years.
You're going to be presenting on this at the forthcoming APRICOT meeting in Jakarta?
I will be presenting on that, and presenting at the forthcoming NANOG meeting in North America in San Francisco at the start of February on the same topic. Because it's not just about routing. It's about the internet. It's about where it's heading, how quickly and why. And that's why sort of this study grounds those predictions in some pretty firm truths about, how you can make these predictions and the degree of certainty that lies behind it, which I think is actually pretty high.
That's really great, Geoff. Thanks.
Well, thank you.
If you've got a story or research to share here on Ping, why not get in contact by email to ping@apnic.net or via the APNIC social media channels. Also, remember the measurement at apnic.net mailing list on Orbit is there to discuss and share relevant collaborative opportunities, grants and funding opportunities, jobs and graduate placings, or to seek feedback from the community on your own measurement projects. Be sure to check out the APNIC website for all your resource and community needs. Until next time.